Did you know that for many African countries, the US dollar was not only stronger than our local currencies? In Nigeria, the promise to have one naira go back to being equal to $1 was a campaign promise for politicians in the months leading up to the 2016 elections. That's 10 years ago. And many Nigerians are still looking forward to that happening. But whether it will happen in this lifetime or not is a question for another video. In this video, however, I want to talk about one major event that led to Africa's current reality. In this series, counting down the top 10 events that I believe brought Africa to its current position. For many Africans, particularly Nigerians, life was good in the 80s. Schools and hospitals were free, but suddenly these hospitals started charging fees or were no longer having drugs. Children who once got free health care at government institutions were now increasingly turning away to private organizations. Salaries stayed the same, but a bag of rice was now costing just as much as what it used to cost to feed an entire family for a month. The naira, almost equal to the dollar, was now in a free fall. Now, unknown to many Nigerians at the time, the government had signed economic deals that would change everything. People were calling it life in Nigeria, but these changes weren't random. In fact, they were part of something much bigger known as structural adjustments, or SAPs. This episode breaks down what happened, how it changed the continent, and what it means for the generation that grew up in the middle of it all. To understand what happened in the 1980s, you need to understand the decade before it. Through the 60s and the early 70s, many newly independent African nations were actually growing. Governments were building schools, hospitals, and roads. There was a genuine sense that independence was not just political, but economic. Nigeria was riding an oil boom. Ghana was exporting cocoa. Zambia had copper. The continent had commodity wealth and ambition. Then, in the late 1970s, the floor dropped out. Global commodity prices collapsed. Oil revenues for non-OPEC countries dried up. The US Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker at the time, raised interest rates dramatically to fight inflation in the United States. For African governments that had borrowed in dollars at that time, this was catastrophic. Their debt repayments suddenly required far more local currency to service. And the goods they were selling on world markets were worth less and less. And by the early 80s, country after country entered crisis. Even Nigeria had to watch its own foreign reserves collapse from roughly $10 billion in the early 1980s to about $1 billion by mid-same decade. What about Ghana? Under Jerry Rawlings and the PNDC, they were experiencing inflation that reached at least 120% or even over by 1983. Shelves were empty. Basic goods were scarce. The economy was shrinking. Zambia, which had bet its future on copper revenues, found the global copper price had collapsed. What about Kenya? It was borrowing to meet basic state functions. Across the continent, governments were running out of road. And that is when the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank arrived with a solution. They called it structural adjustments. And this structural adjustments just wasn't one policy or document. It was a set of rules, different for each country, but always tied to getting loans from the IMF or the World Bank. If your government wanted money, you had to play by their rules, and those rules were mostly the same, no matter where you lived. Now, here's what they actually asked for. First, you had to devalue your currency, remove price supports, let the exchange rate float. In Nigeria, this meant naira lost the majority of its value almost overnight. Everything imported became dramatically more expensive. The next one was to remove subsidies, cut fuel subsidies, cut food price controls, remove the support structures that kept basic goods within reach for ordinary people. And the third was cut government spending. And this saw a reduction in public sector wage bill, a reduction on expenditure for health and education, privatize state-owned enterprises. And the fourth was to liberalize trade, remove protective tariffs, open your markets to foreign goods, regardless of what this does to local manufacturing. And at the time, the theory was that these painful short-term measures would create long-term macroeconomic stability, attract foreign investment, and, this was the most important, generate growth. The reality on ground was something different. Nigeria's SAP was introduced in July 1986 by the then head of state, General Babangida. And it is worth noting that Nigeria did not actually take an IMF loan directly. In fact, the head of state then had famously held a national debate on whether to accept the loan, then adopted IMF's policy prescriptions anyway without the formal loan. He implemented the conditions without the credits, and many say it was the worst of both worlds. The second-tier foreign exchange market was introduced to let the naira find its value. What it found was a long free fall. Inflation, which was at 5.4% back in 1986, hit about. Ghana took a different path. President Rawlings accepted the IMF's economic recovery program in 1983, and Ghana is the case the Bretton Woods institutions point to as their African success story. GDP did improve, macroeconomic indicators stabilized, some rural cocoa farmers saw their incomes rise with the price liberalization. But here's the question the success story does not answer. Success by whose measure? GDP grew, yes, but researchers found the gains were uneven. The widening disparities between urban and rural populations, and a significant deterioration in access to social services for the poor. And even the World Bank eventually acknowledged the results across the continent were modest at best. Their own 1994 evaluation reports, Adjustment in Africa, Reforms, Results, and the Road Ahead, triggered major controversy when African scholars argued it misrepresented the data to make the case for more adjustments. Let's now talk about what happened to the hospitals and schools before structural adjustment took place. Public healthcare in most African countries was either free or heavily subsidized. I said that at the start of this video. SAP changed that. The World Bank, in line with its policy prescriptions, encouraged the introduction of user fees for health services across the continent from the early 1980s onward. Most African countries introduced these late fees in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The results were documented repeatedly across Kenya, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Niger, the Republic of Congo, the Democratic, and Lesotho. When user fees went up, healthcare utilization went down. The poor and those in rural areas were hit hardest. The same dynamic played out in education. Cost to education budgets combined with the economic pressure on families meant children left school. The human capital investment that African governments had made in the 2 decades after independence was now being gradually dismantled. The numbers from researchers are damning. Between 1980 and 1994, Africa's per capita GDP declined from approximately $4,500 to below $4,200 in 2023. Purchasing power for terms, that is. Incomes did not recover to their 1980 levels until 2001. That is over 2 decades of economic decline. The physical toll was literal. Researchers studying Tanzania found that people born in the 1980s, that's the SAP generation, were around a centimeter shorter than people born a decade earlier or even a century earlier. Nutritional stress severe enough to reduce human stature. That was written in bone. It's funny now, but it wasn't back then. And behind these numbers were individual lives. Mothers choosing their school fees or choosing between school fees and food. Or nurses were watching medicine supplies run dry because the hospital budget had been cut. Teachers in classroom with 40 children and no textbook because the government could no longer subsidize printing. And salaries weren't even coming at all. They weren't consistent. This was not just chaos, it was a policy. And this is the part that many economic textbooks and papers typically skip. Structural adjustments did not just cause economic hardship in African countries, it also caused a significant transfer of real material wealth out of the continent. According to research published in the Review of African Political Economy in 2025 by economists Dylan Sullivan and Jason Hickel, it analyzed Africa's total material resource used during this period, and what they found was striking. While many African consumption was declining, African exports were increasing. Africa's material exports grew by 55% during the 1980s and 1990s, while material imports remained virtually stagnant. And you can think about what that meant. The continent was consuming less, but was exporting more. Productive capacity that could have been invested in African industrialization and human capital development was instead being cheapened and exported. By suppressing African export prices relative to import prices, SAP created conditions where Africa was effectively transferring real material value to the global economy for free, pretty much. These researchers called this unequal ecological exchange. You can also just call it what it is: exploitation, extraction. The countries that were labeled failures, like Zambia, for resisting the program, and the ones labeled successes, like Ghana, for implementing it, were both feeding this process. The difference was in how much each country absorbed versus how much it transferred out. One African leader called it exactly what it was, and he paid with his life. On July 29, 1987, Thomas Sankara, the president of Burkina Faso, stood at the summit of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and delivered a speech about debt that is still being quoted today. He told the assembled heads of states that debt had to be understood from the perspective of its origins, that the people lending Africa money were the same people who had colonized Africa, that debt was not a financial arrangement. It was, in his words, a skillfully managed reconquest. Debts cannot be repaid. First, because if we do not repay, lenders will not die. That is for sure. But if we repay, we are going to die. That is also for sure. He proposed an Addis Ababa club of African nations that would collectively refuse to service their debts. He knew what the consequences for Burkina Faso alone would be. He said it plainly. If Burkina Faso stands alone, he would not be at the next conference. He was assassinated 79 days later on October 15, 1987, in a coup widely attributed to involvement from several European countries and executed by his close associate at the time. Coincidence? Who knows? The ideas he articulated in that speech are now mainstream in development economics, to be honest. But in 1987, they were dangerous enough to kill over. The SAP generation in this video is the generation born roughly between 1975 and 1995. I grew up in that era as well. We grew up in a decade when public systems were being dismantled. They went to schools that were overcrowded and underfunded. They were treated in hospitals where drugs were running out and nurses were being retrenched or were being owed salaries. They graduated into economies where formal employment had shrunk because manufacturing had been killed by import liberalization. That generation is right now the working age population of this continent, where I also happen to fall into. We are now obviously the creators on social media. We're now civil servants, entrepreneurs, politicians, professionals. We're now running institutions that SAP left behind. And many of us are dealing with the same institutions the World Bank had reportedly returned to in new forms. The language has changed, no doubt. SAP has now become a poverty reduction strategy paper, but the conditions, they typically remain structurally similar. Like in 2025, Oxfam's Africa director describes the IMF's austerity policies as borrowed playbook from a 1980s, as borrowed policy from a 1980s playbook, pushing governments across the continent to choose between investing in health and education or paying ballooning debts. The scar tissue is not just economic, it is institutional. It is the reason many African governments defaulted to informal systems when formal ones collapsed. It is part of the reason trust between citizens and the state is still fractured in ways that SAP era policies helped create. It is important to say what SAP defenders say because the argument is not nothing. The orthodox position is that many African economies in the early 1980s had genuine structural problems: state overextension, distorted price signals, unsustainable fiscal deficits, and that some form of adjustment was necessary. Ghana's macroeconomic stabilization is usually pointed to as evidence that the policy framework could work when implemented consistently. Some economists argue that countries which resisted adjustment saw worse economic outcomes, that the alternative was not a better deal, but simply continued deterioration without the international credit access that SAP provided. Now, both arguments deserve to be heard, right, from those who support and those who don't. The SAP debate is not simple, to be honest. But here is what the evidence also shows. The World Bank's own headline metrics, GDP growth and inflation, were not measuring the right things. Improvements in macroeconomic aggregates did not always translate into improvements in living standards for ordinary people, and that was a fact. The distributional effects consistently favored trading and propertied classes over workers, farmers, and the urban poor, which is a lot of us. And critically, the program was not designed by the people it affected. SAPs were imposed conditions negotiated behind closed doors between governments desperate for credits and institutions with enormous leverage. African citizens had no seat at that table.